Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's EHS Daily Advisor webcast. Today, we are presenting the dangers of hydrogen sulfide, myths, misperceptions, and effective training strategies, sponsored by PEC Veriforce. My name is Sarah from the EHS Daily Advisor, and before we start today's presentation, there are just a few housekeeping items to go over. The On24 Webinar Council offers multiple application widgets that you can use throughout today's presentation. You can resize, move, or minimize them as you wish. Please note that there is no dial-in for today's event, and the audio will be streaming directly through your computer speakers. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical errors. If your technical issue persists, please enter a question into the Q&A widget, and our team will gladly assist you. Now, on to today's exciting presentation. I am pleased to introduce Chris Detillier, Richard Emberling, and Whitney Green. And I'm going to pass it over to Andre to kick us off with a little bit about PEC and Veriforce.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andre, and I'm in marketing in PEC and Veriforce. Just a quick update on who we are and what we offer. So earlier in 2019, PEC and Veriforce joined forces to create an integrated organization focused on bringing workers home safe, protecting communities, and empowering businesses to mitigate risk in high-hazard work environments. At a company level, we work with organizations to understand their unique risk and compliance management challenges, and we provide SaaS-based safety and compliance solutions that empower them to cultivate safer, more productive, and more efficient job sites. At a worker level, we provide operator qualification solution as well as standardized, verifiable safety orientation and training. We serve clients across multiple industries, and we strive to empower these leading organizations to drive safety and compliance down to the worker level and more effectively mitigate supply chain and regulatory risk. Now I'm going to kick it off to Mr. Chris Detillier to review our takeaways for today.
My name's Chris Detillier with PEC. I am the Senior Safety Advisor as well as a Master Instructor for PEC Safety Veriforce. Today we are talking about the dangers of hydrogen sulfide, the need for proper training. So we'll try to provide you with an understanding of key drivers for training standard to protect workers. Also talk about myths and misperceptions about current hydrogen sulfide training standard. So with that, we will help you ensure your program complies with the current standard and flexible for upcoming updates. We'll also discuss best practices for effective hydrogen sulfide training strategies to reduce the risk of H2S-related incidents. And we'll talk about the importance and benefits of retraining your workers. We'll talk about why retraining works and how to identify signs it's time to retrain your workforce. All right, so the first thing we'll talk about is the need for a training standard. So first off, what is hydrogen sulfide? I know a lot of people wonder what that is. You may have heard of it, you may have not. Basically, hydrogen sulfide is a gas that can occur naturally, or it can be produced during industrial processes. The biggest factor with H2S is it is a highly toxic gas and it is colorless. So being able to see it, in some cases we'll discuss later, smell it. In some cases we can't see that. So it is something that is a significant danger to us in many different industries. So key points, it says here, the byproduct is a byproduct of the desulfurization of oil and gas products. It forms as part of natural gas, petroleum, crude oil. It can also form in sulfur deposits, volcanic gases, and sulfur springs. So many places it occurs naturally. It is definitely a big problem for the oil and gas industry, and it is produced from decomposition of organic materials, so even other industries. Specifically, low oxygen environments can have H2S. So when talking about that, H2S can form as a product, a byproduct, or a waste material. Companies often attempt to recover byproducts, H2S, and convert it into other products. During oil welling operations, we can find it in shale shaker areas, circulation fluid treatment areas, during pipe tripping procedures at the wellhead and cellar and on the rig floor itself. Also, other industries. You can find H2S within sewers, paper pulp mills, coal fire plants, and also even animal blood rendering processes. So this gas can affect many different industries. So some of the big dangers with H2S, at low concentrations, it does have a noticeable rotten egg odor. So a lot of people refer to it as rotten egg gas. It does cause mild to severe respiratory problems at low concentrations. And it has been known as well to cause even chronic exposure symptoms from low concentrations over a long period of exposures. The big thing that we worry about is the high concentration. So at high concentrations of H2S exposure, a person loses their ability to smell the gas, which creates a problem for detection, and it can be fatal with as little as one single breath. So it is something that can sneak up on workers and cause companies to endure fatalities at the workplace with very little notice or warning. Also, it is liquid soluble, which that creates another problem because in some cases we may not realize it is there once we have a liquid solution. Things like tanks, when we clean tanks with oil or other products in the bottom, once we start to agitate those liquids, a lot of times H2S can be released in higher concentrations. And again, like we said earlier, it is hard to detect, so a lot of times it is known as the silent killer. All right, so lack of training and procedures. One of the things we need to be aware of is we talked a little bit about the dangers of H2S. So to counter those dangers, we want to make sure that our workforce is trained properly and that we do have safe working procedures in place to mitigate these hazards and make sure we don't have these incidents. So things that we're at risk for, hiring clients and contractors. Those of you on the webinar, if you do have any risk or any exposure to H2S, we need to think about a lot of things here because for one, the two biggest takeaways, and I'm going to kind of jump around this list a little bit, but the biggest thing is serious injuries and fatalities. They can occur with H2S, and it is very common to have fatalities. So just kind of going into that real quick, a couple things that can, when we do have H2S exposures, like I said, it can cause serious injuries and fatalities, which can be immediate. It's something that could sneak up with little or no warning. And a lot of times when we do have injuries, fatalities with H2S, it does affect multiple workers. So you can have a lot of your workforce that is affected by H2S exposure. Also, long-term medical treatment, lost time, can occur from some of these serious injuries. A lot of times when people get high exposures, they will need long-term treatments, sometimes hyperbaric oxygen therapy to heal from that exposure to that product. So going into some of those injuries, we talked about different industries here. There is a case slide, and it mentions that there's around about $500,000 worth of fines from this one incident. So in this case, this was in Dallas. It says the U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration cited a company for failing to protect workers from hydrogen sulfide after an employee died after exposure to dangerous levels of gas while working in a trench in Dallas, Texas. OSHA inspectors determined that the company exposed employees to hazardous atmospheres, failed to train their employees on the hazards of H2S, and did not drain water from the trench. This cost penalties of $422,006. So we talked a little bit about the serious injuries and fatalities. Not only that, we can have citations from OSHA and from other regulatory agencies based on hydrogen sulfide, and those can incur, of course, hefty fines. Not only that, one thing we don't think about a lot of times is that even though some of these things we may not be cited, we also have to look at legal ramifications to this as well. So these cases can cost companies a lot of money in legal fees and expenses for these cases. Not only that, loss of costs from indirect costs, productivity, having to retrain workers, and in general, just overall morale issues within the workplace. So very important to make sure that we have proper training for those employees. So we talked a little bit about the injuries and fatalities. The reason it's important to train on this, certain industries have different hazards. We just looked at construction and the excavation situation here. Oil and gas. If we don't train workers, a lot of companies and workers don't realize that there are specific hazards. For instance, things like tank gauging. Even if you have a small amount of H2S going into a tank battery, in some cases there's chances that you can have much higher exposures due to certain conditions in that tank battery situation. So if workers don't get proper training, they may not realize that. Also forming. There's tons of different examples if you do research on farming incidents where we talked about decomposition. So manure pits for farmers is a high hazard source for H2S exposure. So there's numerous cases where a person goes into a manure pit in a farm, they get overcome by H2S gas, and unfortunately most farms are usually family run. And you have a dad that goes in, and an uncle, and then a brother, and you end up with multiple fatalities from the same family due to H2S exposure. And in municipalities as well, sewers, those areas are all places where we can be exposed and have these incidents. All right, so regulations and standards. Who regulates and enforces standards on H2S? Several regulations and standards are there for H2S exposure. One of the first ones, of course, we all should be familiar with OSHA, who enforces regulations. OSHA does set some exposure limits for H2S, and they do have requirements for respiratory protection, which we must follow if we have workers working in those areas. One of the big takeaways with OSHA is a lot of people don't realize that they do set an exposure limit, but OSHA doesn't have a lot of regulations in place for H2S. However, one thing we need to be worried about with that is, even though there's no specific standard, OSHA has what they call the general duty clause, which states that as an employer, we have to provide a workplace free of recognized hazards to our employees. We have to provide a safe and healthful working environment. So even though they may not have a standard on this, if we have incidents and we fail to protect our workers properly, we still can be cited by OSHA under that general duty clause. The other governmental regulation is BSEE, which has regulations regarding H2S in offshore oil and gas facilities. So if you do any offshore work, just be aware that BSEE has regulations as well. And then there are other standards in place. One of the big ones is the ANSI standard, which Mr. Richard's going to talk about a little bit later. But ANSI has the Z390 standard, which basically talks about best practices for H2S training for workers. Also, API, American Petroleum Institute, has recommended practice 49 and 55. That also covers H2S for certain oil and gas operations. State plans, if you are in Texas, the Texas Railroad Commission has a lot of standards in place that are followed in Texas for H2S exposures. So we need to be familiar with those. And it says here that both company and workers have responsibilities. So as a company, it is your responsibility to be familiar with these standards and develop your own program and policies on how to protect workers from H2S. So responsibilities of the company is to protect workers from exposure, identify what hazards we have with H2S in our work environment, and make sure that we properly train and do annual retraining for our workers. As a worker, their responsibilities are to attend the training, to utilize the proper PPE that we provide, and also follow those safe work practices. All right, on this slide, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Richard Emberlin.
Good afternoon. My name is Richard Emberlin. I'm the Senior Audit and Training Development Specialist. I am a master instructor as well for PEC Veriforce, and I'm also a member of the ANSI 390 Committee. When we look at ASSP, which was the old ASSE, it's the Global Association for Occupational Safety and Health Professionals. It's also the Secretary for ANSI. And it's an association of occupational safety and health professionals, which consists of over 37,000 members. The ASSP develops and publishes standards focusing on the protection of people, property, and the environment. And the ASSP also serves as administrator for the U.S. TAG, or United States Technical Advisory Group, to the ISO PC 262, which is the International Organization for Standardized Project Committee. The ASSP also acts as a secretariat of the ANSI accredited standards. And then when we look at the ANSI, it's a committee responsible for more than 100 safety standards. It is a private nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the U.S. voluntary standards and conformity assessment system and strengthening its impact both domestically and internationally. ANSI standards are detailed technical documents that provide rules, guidelines, or characteristics for a product or process. These standards aren't legally required unless incorporated by reference. They represent a consensus on what experts consider safe. Looking at the next slide, the need for training standards and how are these standards used. First bullet says industry consensus of best practices often used as guidance for safety programs. When we look at the ANSI 390.1, it is the accepted practices for hydrogen sulfide training programs. Again, it is a voluntary standard for the development of H2S training programs in the workplace. It outlines the ASSP's recommendations for effective training programs, including recommendations for trainer qualifications, training content, and training duration and frequency. The 2017 edition is the most recent version of this standard and represents several changes from the previous version. Again, it is a voluntary standard, but you can be cited for not following voluntary standards. Not all ANSI standards get incorporated by reference into OSHA standards. For example, NFPA Standard for Electrical Safety in the Workplace, or NFPA 70E, isn't incorporated in any OSHA law or regulation, but OSHA may cite you for not following the standard, even though it's not mandatory to do so. And this came out with a letter of interpretation. OSHA standards typically establish the general standards employers must meet without specifying how. OSHA gives the employer discretion to decide how best to achieve the standards goals. But OSHA and the courts do say how they expect the employer to use the discretion provided by the standard. Among other things, employers are expected to consider any existing consensus standards, that is, non-legislative standards adopted by industry and other non-governmental organizations. Even though these standards aren't legally required, they represent a consensus of what experts consider safe. So OSHA might regard an employer's failure to adopt a voluntary standard relating to an OSHA requirement as evidence that it didn't take the responsible or reasonable steps to comply with the standard. And you can also be cited under the general duty clause that Chris brought up earlier if you don't use this. Who makes up the committee? ANSI's members are government agencies, organizations, academic international bodies, and individuals. In total, the Institute represents the interests of more than 270,000 companies and organizations and 30 million professionals worldwide as gas operators, transportation industry, universities, Coast Guard, contractors, and such. The ASSP ANSI Z390.1 committee is made up of approximately 30 members from consulting companies, safety equipment manufacturers, insurance companies, oil and gas, and other associations. And looking at the next bullet there, what led to the standard and subsequent revisions. We're looking at commonly cited incidents and fatalities is one that we looked at. But one of the things that we looked at was there had been little change since the initial adoption. The last formal revision was in 2006. We took and wanted to make this revision that we come up with in 2017 more comprehensive. We wanted to make it user-friendly, We changed to a single column format, eliminated redundant materials, eliminated dated references, improved logical flow of the paragraphs and structures. We made it less prescriptive. We took on tackle changes. We took on the changing safe exposure levels and wanted to make sure that we got the right one in there, and we stayed with the 10 parts per million. Our goal was to protect the safety and health of the workers. We wanted to minimize the burden on industry to the extent possible, but when in conflict, we always defaulted back to protecting the workers. And the committee wanted to raise the bar on the training and to get some consistency in the training, because we know there was a lot of training going on out there with 15 minutes here, 30 minutes there, an hour there. So we came in and put it in the standard of what we felt like was needed to be required. Also in that, the overheads, videos no longer are available. Were in there. You couldn't get the videos that were suggested. The delivery format was not flexible, and it referenced the curriculum was more for the oil field petrochemical subjects, and failed to consider the non-oil field hazards. So with the new sections we added in to address research lab training, and we're going to continue to involve more industries as we can. Here we have a poll question. It says, at what level PPM does the ability to detect odors become compromised? And if you will go ahead and make your choice here, is it 10 to 20 parts per million, 40 to 50 parts per million, or 100 to 150 parts per million? Go ahead and submit. So the correct answer was 100 to 150 parts per million. You begin to lose the smell or the olfactory fatigue or paralysis in approximately 15 minutes. So those of you who said 100 to 150 parts per million, you were correct. The next part of this is the myths and misperceptions. Looking at the myths, computer-based training meets the updated ANSI Z390.1 2017 standard. We'll discuss this. We'll discuss training is valid throughout a worker's career. And we'll discuss the myth of visitors do not require full training or abbreviated training is sufficient. And then we will also discuss I do not work in an H2S environment, so I don't need H2S training. Looking at the first one here, computer-based training meets the updated ANSI Z390.1 2017 standard. Mention of computer-based training was removed from the updated standard in 2017, and in 5.1 it talks about training instructors shall have successfully completed an appropriate H2S train-to-trainer development course. They shall also be deemed qualified if they possess significant past experience in instructing in this field. The instructors shall be able to demonstrate their knowledge of the technical aspects of H2S training and proficiency in training techniques relating to H2S. Training credentials or certification from a recognized or accredited training authority constitutes qualifications under this section. And when we look at what OSHA defines as a qualified person, It's an individual who, by possession of a recognized degree, certificate, or certificate or professional standing, or who by extensive knowledge, training, and experience has successfully demonstrated his ability to solve or resolve problems relating to the subject matter, the work, or the project. And when we were looking at this, we originally had in the wording, certification training shall always be delivered by a qualified instructor in an appropriate and organized teaching space, safe and free from hazardous conditions and other requirements as required by ANSI ASSP Z490.1. And due to some confusion, we're in the process of amending this to where it's going to say a qualified instructor must be physically present in the classroom. A blended course of the learning techniques such as PowerPoint, short videos, and hands-on training is acceptable. Computer-based training by itself is not an acceptable method for delivering the hydrogen sulfide safety information. So here we're saying that CPT by itself is not going to meet this standard. Safety and health training involves the presentation of technical materials to audiences that typically have not had formal education in technical or scientific disciplines, such as in areas of chemistry or physiology. In an effective training program, it is critical that trainees have the opportunity to ask questions where material is unfamiliar with them. So with CBT, we felt like that there was the possibility that there would not be anyone there to answer those questions. And equally important is the use of hands-on training and exercise to provide trainees with the opportunity to become familiar with equipment and safe practices in a non-hazardous setting. Many industrial operations and in particular hazardous waste operations can involve many complex and hazardous tasks. It's imperative that employees be able to perform such tasks safely. And traditional hands-on training is the preferred method to ensure the workers are prepared to safely perform these tasks. The purpose of the hands-on training, for example, in the donning and doffing of personal protective equipment, is twofold. First, to ensure the workers have an opportunity to learn by experience, and second, to assess whether workers have mastered the necessary skills. It is unlikely the sole reliance on computer-based training program is likely to achieve these objectives. Thus, OSHA, and this is a statement from OSHA, says thus OSHA believes that computer-based training programs can be used as part of an effective safety and health training program to satisfy OSHA training requirements, provided that the program is supplemented by the opportunity for trainees to ask questions of a qualified trainer and provides trainees with sufficient hands-on experience. Looking at the next one here, training is valid throughout a worker's career. A fact, completion of full instructor-led course is required annually. And when we look at the standard, it talks about in 7.2, due to the extreme hazard involved in H2S operations, each individual covered by this standard shall be trained annually. And talks about credentials must reflect course completion date. 7.1 says documented proof of the student competency shall be required at the end of the training in order to receive completion documentation. Common forms of performance-based evaluation includes written test and, where applicable, documented skills demonstration. Hands-on will be determined by what tasks the students will perform. If they are evacuating when alarm sounds, hands-on training would pertain to how to use their gas detector properly. If the student is going to work under air, they will need to be trained in several different things here. We're talking about the respiratory protection program. We're talking about an H2S program. They got to have medical evaluations. They got to be fit tested. They got to wear a respirator, have proper inspection, know how to properly inspect it, proper donning and doffing, proper face seal check on each specific brand, proper maintenance and storage, hands-on training with that specific brand. Each worker using a detector or monitor needs to be trained on the following: the proper use of that particular detector, purpose, suitability, capabilities, limitations, and placement, the chemicals and other factors that could give inaccurate results. Proper bump testing, and this is a big one that we find as we go out here. Proper calibration, required hands-on training with that specific type, and if applicable, training on rescue. And on the completion of the document card, you have to have the name of the student, the date of the training, and the name of the training provider with which the instructor is affiliated, and a statement that the program conforms to ANSI /ASSP Z3941 2017. And again, annual retraining shall include all course content. Next myth, visitors do not require full training. Fact, visitor to a site with present H2S dangers must receive full instructor-led training. And in 2.16, under visitor, it says an individual who is visiting a job site for a short period of time who is not required to provide any of the operational or control activities at the site. Visitors are not exempt from the initial and annual H2S training. And then looking at, I do not work in an H2S environment. In fact, all personnel working in an area where concentration of H2S exceeds OSHA's permissible limit of 10 parts per million, or PPE, must undergo training. Some common areas of potential H2S exposure, like it says here on the slide, are cellars, confined spaces, containment dikes, heater treaters, manholes, manure pits, mud systems, pits, sewers, tanks, trenches, vacuum trucks, and we can get on to several others. There's about 80 different verticals when we get into looking at who needs H2S training. And looking at some of the H2S dangers that we see in the oil and gas and across other industries, you know, even though we have a standard, people are still being are still dying every year, you know, due to H2S exposure. I was looking up statistics of 2018, and there was approximately 19 fatalities and 4 hospitalizations that I found. Transportation, while washing out 3 out-tank trucks, we had 3 fatalities, and these were a sustainable food, feed, and fuel ingredient solutions company, a tank cleaning company, and then one of the employees was adding chemicals to an asphalt tanker. So this is just not in the oil and gas industry. Utility services had 11 fatalities and 3 hospitalized. They doing sewer systems installation and repair, and 2 of the fatalities were a father and son. A drilling rig had 1 hospitalization around the shaker. Gas plant had a fatality performing maintenance. Looking at some other contractors, there were 4 fatalities. One was a welder repairing a hog pen, and he was in the hog pens, and there was high H2S there, and he actually went to the restroom early in the morning and was come out feeling really sick. They took him out, let him sit for a little while. He come back in and went back to welding and was in that H2S. And if you remember, Chris talked about chronic exposure, long-term exposure. He was exposed to H2S for a long term, went back to the restroom. They didn't notice he wasn't back in a little while. They went and they found him. He was dead there at in the restroom. And he had died of H2S exposure over a long period of time. Another one was working on electrical systems in a tank battery, tank gauging, and working on a heater treater. And when we get back and look at what caused this, most of it was due to lack of training. You know, I do a lot of audits on contractors throughout the oil and gas industries, and this is some of the things that I find is people are just doing confined space awareness and not getting in and really training to a competency level. The same thing with H2S training. Then they expect these people to go in and do this work, and we see these folks are dying. Here we have an audience question. What precautions should be used in confined space where H2S is present or could be? And when I look at this, I look at the confined space training that you need, but beyond that, I would have to say that monitoring or detector training is the big one, and then getting in and doing continuous monitoring. And I have a friend that I worked with. His dad was doing work in a refinery and was working in a bullet tank. And there was 2 employees. They had went in and had tested everything. There was no gases, no H2S, anything. And they went in and started the work, and my friend's dad got to feeling nauseated, so he said, I'm going up. He went up and got to feeling better after he got out in the fresh air and started back in and noticed his co-worker was down. So he sounded the alarm, but he went on in to try to get him out. And the safety director got there. He looks in, 2 people down. He goes in, and when the emergency response team gets there, they had 3 people down. Fortunately, all 3 lived. But where was it at? The lack of training. Not looking at things like, there's something wrong here. I feel something's wrong. I'm getting nauseated. We need to get out of here. So if we know these signs and symptoms, if we're taught on these, then we can make those judgment calls and get out. And we wouldn't have 3 people down. And at this time, I'm going to turn it back to Chris Detillier, and he's going to talk here a little bit about best practices for effective training.
All right, so best practices for effective training. One of the big things we need to look at is, it says here the 3 bullets. For one, we need to implement an H2S training requirement. So we need to figure out what type of training we need, make sure that we have that requirement, that our employees that are exposed are getting the appropriate training. Also, we need to make sure, of course, we implement that program. Part of it is requiring and making sure that the training gets done, as well as any retraining that's needed. And we just said for H2S, that's on an annual basis, so we need to make sure that that is being done accordingly. And to make those things happen, we need to seek a reliable instructor or certify an in-house instructor to deliver H2S training. One other thing we need to keep in mind, I know we're talking about H2S on this, this is important for all health and safety topics throughout our company. So as employers, I challenge you to go back and determine what hazards your workers are faced with on a daily basis. Make sure that they're given the tools and the knowledge that they need to be safe and successful within the workplace. So definitely make sure we're giving them that. All right, so the first one, implementing an H2S training requirement. All parties are responsible to prevent serious injuries and possible fatalities. So the biggest thing is, as a company, like I said, we need to perform a needs assessment and look in and see what training is needed. What level are we going to be sending our workers into? Are they going to a site and it may be H2S, and if it's there, we're getting them out and they're non-essential? Or are we going to actually send them in to work in H2S environments? Because that takes on 2 whole different levels of training that we need to be providing. Clients with job sites in areas with known H2S dangers should require that their contractors undergo proper H2S training. So again, make sure that if you are, we're talking about clients here, but even on the construction side, if we have a general contractor that's over a location, if you have contractors or other companies coming to your location, make sure that we communicate with them what hazards are there so that we make sure that they're prepared to come on our site and work safely. Contractors should proactively train their workers, and by doing this, we increase readiness of those workers. We also reduce the risk of costly fines and penalties, and again, we prepare them for success when working at our locations. Require and verify retraining. So with this one, sure, retraining is required and communicated to workers. So if you haven't done this, like I said, when we do our training needs assessment for the different trainings we're going to provide to our workers, develop and incorporate either a training matrix. That way we know who's going to be taking what training is needed for different tasks and personnel within our company, or make sure you develop a training plan. So have that written out and have a procedure for how are you going to make sure that we ensure that our workers are getting this adequate training prior to going to work. And then proactively communicate training expiration to workers. One thing that I like to mention on this is if we do have training such as H2S, which is annual, we need to make sure to have a way of determining when that training is expiring. So have a system in place to do that. You could use systems. You can have your own system. Even with us, PEC Veriforce, things like the training tracker, advanced training tracker tools. You can utilize some type of system to make sure that you know when training is fixing to expire. And if you do that, one of the big things is do not wait till the last minute. Try to give some time, because a lot of times what we see is companies will wait till the last minute to do that retraining, and my worker's training's expiring next week, but I got this job, I got to send them on today. And we end up sending that worker out there without the required refresher training on the timeline that is needed for compliance. So make sure we have a plan in place to do that. And then lastly, utilize reputable courses and providers. So training several dozen employees a year, if you have a lot of people at your training, it may make sense for you to certify an in-house instructor to deliver that training and recurring training. If this is the case, make sure that, if you're the instructor, you have an in-house instructor, tailor that program towards your company. Add things in company specific to make it, make it relatable to your employees. Also, make sure that you have the appropriate resources to do that. There's time and time again, I see companies that go, it seems beneficial to say, I'm going to have an in-house instructor. But if that instructor doesn't have the time to devote to that training, a lot of times we see shortcuts take place. So if you're going to do that, make sure that you really sit down and think, do I have enough time, or does this person have enough time in their day to focus on training? Or do I need to hire someone in-house as a trainer and leave it at that? So just make sure that we're prepared. Or you can partner with a reputable mobile instructor or training facility for your annual training needs. If we do that, I would just say if you're the company that's doing that and you're subbing out your training, make sure you utilize a reputable provider and audit that training provider. Go sit in some classes, see what their teaching skills are. Choose a training provider that fits your company and what you're trying to get across. So think about that. When we put someone through training, we are preparing them to work for our company. So we want to make sure that we're giving them what they need. So definitely be involved in that process. Make sure they're a good fit. And once we decide on a training provider, communicate to them company specifics that need to be added in. If you're sending someone to go do your H2S training and you're telling them do fit testing for my employees and respiratory protection training as well, and you don't communicate to that company what mask or what type of respirator you're using, that training is obsolete. It's not beneficial. So we need to make sure to communicate those key points and look at the whole system to make sure that we're providing adequate training to those workers. All right, we have a poll question here. Does your organization have an H2S training requirement today? So go ahead and give you a little while to select an answer. So submit your answer, and we'll probably wait about 20, 30 seconds or so, and we'll go in and check the results. All right, so we've got a good bit that do. Some do not, but they're considering, and a couple don't feel that they have a need for one. So again, may be the case. We just have to assess what we're doing within our company and make sure that that is the case. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Whitney Green to discuss the importance and benefits of refresher training.
Good afternoon. My name is Whitney Green. I've been with PEC Veriforce for 7 years as their safety analyst for the training development team. And today I'm going to talk about the importance and benefits of refresher training. So what is refresher training? Refresher training is the training used to recall and reinforce previous acquired knowledge and skills. Refresher training should be a part of every company's injury and illness prevention programs. Injury and illness prevention programs are used as proactive measures to help employers find and fix workplace hazards before workers are hurt. Refresher training is an important part of these programs for a few reasons, so we're going to cover a couple of statistics to support this. It increases information retention. 80% of safety training information is lost after 2 days. Now, this can vary depending on many factors, such as the type of training given, is it hands-on, is it computer-based, the length of time that the training occurred, familiarity with the refresher topic, many things. When it comes to adult learning, some studies say that workers will retain 10% of what they read, 20% of what they hear, 30% of what they see, 50% of what they hear and do, 70% of what they say, and 90% of what they both say and do. And this is important that in your refresher training, for example, if you're conducting an H2S training and you have students in the respiratory part actually don a respirator and discuss the steps of putting on a respirator, during the training, they're both physically doing it and saying it, the retention is likely going to be much higher. The second thing here is that 40% of workers leave within 1 year without proper training. That's a pretty high number, and it can cost companies an average of 33% of the employee's salary to replace them. It also helps improve safety. 50% of adults retain less than 50% of what they retain less than 50% of what they learn within 1 hour of safety training. So employers who conduct regular scheduled refresher training experience a decrease in workplace injuries, transform workplace cultures, see higher productivity and quality, reduce turnovers, reduce costs, and greater employee satisfaction. So refresher training can also increase productivity, attract employees, increase job confidence, and lower operational costs. Refresher training increases productivity. So 40% of organizations report increased productivity due to training. 42% of millennial workers value refresher training when evaluating employers' company. So nurturing employees to develop their skill helps them contribute to your company. The more engaged and involved they are, the better their work environment. They cite a lack of skills, training, and development as a principal reason for moving on. And another one here, 75% of employees believe they are safer on the job when they have refresher training. The ANSI Committee realizes the importance of refresher training in our high-hazard industry and requires hydrogen sulfide training to be conducted at least annually. While this webinar focuses on hydrogen sulfide training, don't forget that annual refresher training is required for many safety and health hazards common in our industry. And refresher training also lowers operating costs. More than 25% of organizations who regularly conduct refresher training report cost decreases in their operating costs. So this statistic's a little hard to quantify because it's based off of your direct cost savings that companies have reported. Refresher training can also help decrease many indirect costs. So look at things such as the cost of incident investigations, the implementation of corrective measures, loss of productivity, cost of repairs of damaged equipment and property, and costs associated with employee morale. So how do you know when it's time for refresher training? Here are a couple of signs. Repetitive and costly mistakes are happening. Infrequent tasks and processes are having to be restarted. Recordable incidents are increasing. New equipment or technology is introduced. Or serious safety incidents occur. So these are just a few. Decreased productivity and quality of work or other signs. We can discuss many of them. So are these any problems that you're having within your organization? If so, refresher training might be part of your answer. And it's not about just conducting refresher training to check off a box. It's about quality refresher training using effective training methods. Safety, quality, and productivity go hand in hand. All right, we're going to look at a couple of audience questions that were pre-submitted now. Sarah?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. All right, so we do have some questions that have come in. So let's kick off with the Q&A with the first question. What is the ideal profile of someone who would be a good candidate for a in-house instructor?
All right, this is Chris Atelier. I'm going to answer that one. So if you're wanting an in-house instructor, a couple of things. For one, experience with training. is going to be important. I would say the most important thing to look for out of that is their want to actually fill that role. Good training comes with passion. If you're not passionate about what you're doing and wanting to coach and mentor the employees, that person is probably not going to be a good fit for an in-house instructor. So knowledge is going to be important. Having some experience with training, like I said earlier, having the resources and time to devote to training is going to be important. And mainly the want to do it, the want to actually help those employees be safer on the job site.
Thanks so much, Chris. The next question I have for you guys is there a OSHA mandated amount of time for an employee H2S training? Does ANSI recommend 4 hours of H2S training in the Z390.1 standard?
This is Richard Emberling. No, OSHA has no mandate on the amount of time for training employees in H2S. And when we look at the ANSI standard, it says a minimum of 3 hours, and we recommend between 3 to 4. And when I try to cover all that material, it takes me more than 3 hours. It's usually a good 4 to 4.5 hours to really cover it and cover it like you should and be able to answer the questions that you need to with your students.
Thank you so much, Richard. The next question I have for you is, what are the U.S. regulatory requirements related to H2S that are applicable to water waste industry?
This is Richard again. This would fall back to if you're an OSHA state or your state is governing the municipalities. But I would look at what OSHA requires and make sure that I'm covering that. But I would definitely look at my state and make sure that you're doing what they require. I'm from Oklahoma, and the municipalities were not covered under OSHA. They were covered under the state Department of Labor, and so you need to find out where you're regulated or who you're regulated by.
Thanks, Richard. The next question I have for you is, can the gas travel a half a mile or further?
This is Richard again. Yes, it all depends on the amount, the wind speed, and all this. This is where when we're doing a contingency plan, we're drilling wells, and we might be able to hit an H2S zone. We do dispersion models. We take in the amount of gas released and the wind direction and all, and run the dispersion models and see how far it can go. But it can go half a mile or even further, depending on the amount of H2S and the wind and all.
Thank you, Richard. The next question I have for you is the training standard presented a way applicable to industries other than oil and gas? That's the one we already answered. Yeah.
This is Chris Detillier again, and the answer to that is yes. The ANSI Z390.1 standard does list many different industries as well as oil and gas, and as Richard said, they are constantly working on this standard to incorporate even more industries as they go. So the hazards are still the same, the gas is still the same. That standard still is recommended for those industries as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. The next question I have for you is, can wind blow H2S into workers at a distance of 10 to 20 feet away from the source?
Yeah, this is Chris again, definitely. It depends on concentration. It depends on a lot of things go into place with that, topography of the land, wind speeds. But yeah, if you have a high enough release, it can blow that far onto workers. There's actually been a lot of cases too in some areas where there's a lot of wells close to each other. There have been cases where one location may have a release and it actually triggers alarms and sets off alarms at other locations nearby. So it is something that we have to keep in mind on wind conditions, wind direction. And really, we talked about this, but the biggest key takeaway with this whole H2S program is having the appropriate monitoring there to know when it's in that area.
Thanks, Chris. The next question I have for you is, are employers and building owners responsible for checking training and safety plans of all vendors performing work on our work sites?
And again, the answer, this is Richard, and again, the answer is yes. If you've got contractors coming onto your facilities, you're still responsible to make sure that they are have the proper training and everything as well. And even goes down into the subcontractors and on down as well.
Thank you so much, Richard. There's so many great questions coming in. I'm trying to filter through the ones that we should go and ask next. Let's see here. How about this one? How many actual operators participated in the committee that you talked about earlier, Chris?
Yeah, I believe there was 2 operators that participated.
Awesome, thank you. And the next question I have for you is, any recommendations for good respirator cartridges for H2S filtration at medium or low concentration?
This is Chris Atilia again. The one issue that comes up with that is, so on H2S cartridges, generally people go with supplied air respirators for H2S. When you talk about air purifying respirators, anything over 10 parts per million is generally when workers will need to be protected. The issue with H2S is it's usually not going to be in a steady state. You never know, it can go from 10 parts per million to a large release very quickly. So generally, cartridges are not, or air purifying respirators are not a good respirator to use for H2S exposures.
Awesome, thank you. And let's wrap it up with one last question. What is the process needed to certify an in-house instructor? Who determines that in-house instructor is certified?
This is Chris Atilia again. That's a great question. And honestly, when you look at that and you look at a lot of OSHA regulations, it is very vague. OSHA basically puts that back on the employer and says that they are responsible for certifying. So, or not certifying, but saying that they feel that person is qualified to teach that course for that company. With that being said, a lot of liability that goes in there. Since there's not anything vague or anything, or since there's not anything direct that states what has to be done, it's very vague. So you need to make sure, if you are saying that someone is qualified to train for your company, that you feel 100% confident that they have the knowledge and the ability to appropriately get that material across. Also, I know for us as PEC, on our PEC H2S Clear course and our other courses, we do have trainer-trainer courses, and we look at years of experience. Also, we put them through a trainer-trainer. We will go through and actually audit or make sure that they teach, and we evaluate that instructor's teaching ability prior to authorizing them to teach our materials. So having a plan in place to do that and a procedure is going to be important.
This is Richard again. When we were writing up the standard, we did put in there that the company could look at a person's experience. If they've been teaching H2S over a period of time and stuff, they could go ahead and authorize that person. So, but again, it goes back to, like Chris says, the qualifications, looking at how many years they've been in the industry and how many years have they been training, and are they really knowledgeable of the subject. So I would be very cautious, in making those determinations, but it is there for you.
And this is Chris. One more thing I want to add to that, Sarah. So we did talk about legal responsibility a lot. So one thing to just keep in mind on that, OSHA and everything that they do says the employer shall on all of these things. So as a company, everyone on this call, the employer, or you as the employer, is responsible for keeping workers safe. So that means the training program that's established, it is up to the company to make sure that that is a reputable training program. So as an employer, if there is an incident, just be aware that if something comes up, you may be, in front of an attorney having to answer what process you use to make sure that person was qualified to deliver that content. So you need to make sure that you feel comfortable with the answer you're going to give.
Thank you so much, Chris and Richard. So we're going to wrap it up right there. We do have one more poll question we did want to include, and that is, would you be interested in someone from Veriforce PEC contacting you about implementing an H2S training requirement? That is currently up on your screen for you guys to answer and submit. Did you, Chris, Richard, or Whitney have any final comments you wanted to add before we wrap up today's presentation?
No, be safe out there.
Always great advice. Well, I would like to thank you guys so much for being here today and presenting for us. I would especially like to thank today's webinar PEC Veriforce for making today's event possible. A few final notes before we wrap it up. You will receive an email from the EHS Daily Advisor within the next 24 hours that contains a link to today's recording, should you like to view it again or pass it over to a friend. Lastly, at the close of today's webcast, you will see an exit survey. To make each webcast valuable to you, we would appreciate your input. EHS Daily Advisor and PEC Veriforce would like to thank you again for joining us today. This concludes our program. Thank you and have a great day.